Hello there, this is James S. Croft, EU James 1978, and continuing on from the previous part of this series, Links der die Underbar, even if they're merely exploiting them to achieve their own self-serving ends and will throw them under the bus the moment that they've served their purpose, how can racist homophobes, for example, willingly side with black lesbian women against their mutually perceived boogeyman of trans ideology? Ooh. Quite simply for the same reason that anti-Semites declare they love the state of Israel and support its war against Muslims and continuing attempts to create a fully segregated ethno-state, and why homophobic neo-Nazis make a show of protecting LGBTQIA+ people from homophobic Muslims, namely the fact that no different from the I'm to the left of Stalin but black lesbians and other token dupes who they can exploit because they're too scared of trans women gaining full equality to notice or care that their Christo-fascist allies are the only actual threat, they're focused entirely on the imaginary threat that's occupying their attention in that moment, and bearing in mind what I said in the second video in this series about them being total hypocrites who believe, say, and do whatever makes them feel superior and, quote, owns the libs at that moment, when they're feeling threatened by hashtag trans groomers, they're not feeling quite as threatened by black people, lesbians, immigrants, or what have you, especially the ones who they perceive as being on their side because they're one of the good ones. So although they'll almost certainly feel threatened by and persecute them again in the future, with the condemnation of hashtag groomers almost immediately spreading to drag queens, and from there to the rest of the LGBTQIA+ community, for the moment at least, their interests align.
So it's already starting to begin here in Florida. Insurance companies denying gender affirming care. I received a story in my inbox today from a mother. Her daughter, who is an adult, who has Blue Cross Blue Shield here in Florida, went to have an IUD placed, and her insurance here in the state of Florida denied paying for her IUD to be placed because they can deny coverage for gender affirming care, meaning this young woman who was going to have birth control hormones, her insurance company was able to say, no, we're not going to pay for that because in Florida, we don't have to now. Good luck to you in this dystopian hellscape now. Because while the conservatives want to cheer for this one, they're all getting fucked too. And when little Susie Rottencrotch, who is pro-life, can't go get her birth control place, she can take issue with the Republican majority that she voted for passing these laws. Because this is what we voted for, right? And this isn't going to be the first that we hear of it. It's only going to get worse.
Far beyond sexuality and gender identity as well, although American I'm Not Racist Buts build their entire narrative around the fairy tale that the Irish were once oppressed to the point of literally being regarded as black, but then pulled themselves up by their bootstraps, assimilated, and became white, so that's what black people need to do instead of constantly whining about how oppressed they are. The reality is that white America felt more threatened by black people, so they let the Irish joined the white club. Because remember, far from being a race or an ethnicity, what we call white is literally nothing but a label which the privileged in-group of Anglo-Saxon and Germanic Protestants invented a few centuries ago to reinforce the exclusion of everyone else, most of whom they'd arbitrarily labelled as coloured and sorted into a colour-coded hierarchy with themselves at the top. A fact which we still see to this day whenever we declare that an individual or a group of people are non-white, no matter how unconsciously, still dividing humanity into the included superior good people and everyone else, and also an uncomfortable reality which is perfectly demonstrated by the fact that the Irish weren't considered white until it was politically convenient, because after Bacon's rebellion, the possibility that the inferior outgroups would band together to overthrow the ruling order filled them with constant existential dread, just as the Spartans lived in constant existential terror that they would be overthrown by their own slaves.
Now, I'm hoping that I don't need to defend the idea that slavery in America was very much a race thing. Yes, the institution of slavery existed in the world before the transatlantic slave trade, and there were indentured servants from Europe for a time in America, but it's also true that slavery in the New World was a uniquely brutal institution, and that after uprisings like Bacon's Rebellion that saw European and African servants join forces against the ruling elite, lawmakers began to make legal distinctions between white and black inhabitants by permanently enslaving Virginians of African descent and giving poor white indentured servants and farmers some new rights and status, and that this dynamic metastasized over time and is actually why we have the socially and legally constructed categories of race in America in the first place, and that the laws and social dynamics continue to, you know what, actually, I'm not gonna do this right now. Frankly, this is something that this guy and everyone should have been taught in middle school.
So slowly and erratically over the course of 3 centuries, and with countless pushbacks whenever they felt threatened again, white society extended what W.E.B. Du Bois described as the public and psychological wages of whiteness to the Irish and other previously inferior Europeans, such as Italians and Slavs.
Poor white conservatives have been passive participants in their own oppression due to a campaign of misinformation and a series of wedge issues designed by politicians and capitalists to distract them from said oppression. In the late 19th century, following the American Civil War, white plantation owners feared emerging labor class unity. A unity among the working class, regardless of race and other factors, is strong enough to collectivize. The plantation owners could not have that, and ignited a wedge issue. The idea that poor white workers could not trust newly freed poor black workers due to the latter's resentment of whites in general so soon after the abolition of slavery. White plantation owners, so soon after losing all their free slave labor, did whatever they could to hold on to their position in the economic classes. Thus, white plantation owners built a political coalition with poor white men to overthrow integrated Reconstruction governments throughout the South. Rather than joining forces with the multitude of poor black workers to organize against their own exploitation, poor white workers sided with rich white plantation owners, choosing racism over class solidarity. They mistakenly believed the misinformation about who their real enemy was. One needs to understand the power dynamics of misinformation here. Rich white plantation owners could campaign, hold rallies, provide literature to those who could read, pay off politicians to side with them, and use their wealth in other ways to help further their cause and their coalition with poor white workers. Poor black workers had no wealth, no political influence. The argument was rigged against them. Obviously, the intersection of race and poverty presented black workers with greater challenges than white workers, but in one respect, they faced an identical challenge with white workers. Nevertheless, in a campaign of misinformation versus a campaign that goes unseen, the misinformation will win every time. Capitalists protect their interests by driving a wedge between workers, making it impossible for them to organize.
Even now in the 21st century as well, this process of expanding the definition of white to help keep power out of the hands of those we're more afraid of is continuing, with Asians, Jews and light-skinned Hispanics and Latinx who know their place and also don't hate immigrants or black people, but being welcome to walk the tightrope of being honorary white, until something inevitably triggers the dominant in-group xenophobic bigotry against them and they go back to being the inferior outgroup, with the perfect example of this from recent times being the way that COVID instantly transformed the supposed model minority back into being the disease-spreading communist threat of decades past.
For all the talk you might have heard of Asian immigrants being preferable to immigrants from Africa or the Middle East, the second they think they have a plausible excuse, this minority group is going under the bus just as quickly. This pandemic will be used to justify portraying people of Asian descent as dangerous and disease-ridden, all in an effort to create what every fascist wants, an ethno-state. And we can see some of this anti-Chinese and, more broadly, anti-East Asian sentiment manifesting itself right now. The FBI has warned of a possible surge in hate crimes in the US, and in Canada there have been increased reports of Canadians of Southeast Asian descent facing discrimination. Here are some words from Cynthia Choi, the co-executive director of Chinese for Affirmative Action.
We are very, very concerned in the Asian American community that this will have a lasting impact. We have yet to understand the full extent of what it will mean to come out on the other side. We don't think that the anti-Asian sentiment that we're seeing now is going to go away, and we're going to need to address that as a society.
And make no mistake, using terms like Chinese virus and the fixation of Chinese people as a threat is part of a long-term game. We've been hearing echoes of this from the exact same commentators for years. Here's another Paul Joseph Watson clip. This is from December of 2019, titled, "Diversity is Our Strength."
Now, I haven't quite been able to put my finger on it, but could there be some kind of connection between the relative safety of these countries and the kind of people who live there? But who needs safety when you can have diversity? I know which one I'd choose.
Diversity.
Who needs actual borders when you can just have internal diversity barriers?
It's a simple video with a simple message. There need to be fewer people of color in Europe and North America. Previously, this was largely about Muslim immigrants and refugees, capitalizing on the increase in anti-Muslim sentiment after September 11th, and I think this makes clear what the fascist playbook looks like, because they really only have one go-to move, and that's scapegoating minority groups.
Bearing all of this in mind, then, how could anyone ever possibly accuse the Tories of being racist, sexist, and xenophobic when their membership have elected 3 white, wealthy female prime ministers who went to the right schools, believed all the same things as the rest of the leadership, and didn't hate immigrants and poor people, but have appointed several black and brown millionaires to the cabinet because they also went to the right schools, believe all the same things, and don't hate immigrants and poor people but as well. And after the 3rd female Tory Prime Minister elected by the membership, not the people, crashed and burned in less than 50 days in a kamikaze mission to destroy the British economy that almost caused a global recession as well, they've now appointed the loser in the previous leadership election, ringing the contest because they knew he could never possibly win a leadership election on his own merits, and thus proved once and for all that any multi-millionaire banker who went to an elite boarding school in Oxford and doesn't hate immigrants and poor people but can be appointed the token puppet of Britain's corporate, millionaire and billionaire overlords and banking elite, even if he just happens to be brown. Conservative and Unionist Party of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, truly the spirit of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. lives on through thee. Honestly, how could anyone ever possibly describe this as pick-me tokenism when appointing them to high office allows the 97% white and overwhelmingly male party membership to pretend that it isn't racist or sexist because some of our best fascists are black and brown women? Because, just in case you didn't catch the ever-so-subtle sarcasm there, as George Orwell explains in the novel 1984, the ruling body of a homophobic and transphobic white supremacist patriarchy will inevitably include token black, lesbian, trans women who embrace, uphold, and perpetuate the system which marginalises the rest of those outgroups in order to keep wealth and power out of their hands.
The relationship African people here in the United States, black people in the United States have had is one of colonialism, hostility, extraction, exploitation from day one. So there has always been in all of those relationships, whether it's between black and white or any other groups and other groups, when you have those relationships, the goal is always to find members of the colonized or the oppressed community that will represent that community in a favorable way. So whether it was overseers, yeah, exactly. I mean, there's always, whether it's a trustee in a prison or an overseer on a plantation or, there's always a version of that because ultimately at the end of the day, the ruling elite are always numerically at a disadvantage. So you always, from their perspective, have to incorporate others from those you rule. Just the numbers game. It's just that simple. There has been an overt desire on part of those in power to replace radical leaders with more acceptable leaders.
After all, the reason why declaring that some of my best friends are black and I can't possibly be a misogynist because I love my wife and mother is a crock is because, as feminists have been pointing out for a long time now, the question is not how you treat members of the marginalised outgroup who you like and agree with, which is to say, the ones who don't make you feel uncomfortable, threatened or judged, but how you treat the ones who do. Because as I've already explained in this video series, the real issue isn't whether you feel threatened by individual members of the outgroup, but whether you feel threatened by the prospect of no longer having the power of veto to draw the line and declare that they have enough equality, freedom, or rights.
So, why would any non-white man want to even join the Proud Boys? Historically speaking, some in the minority will always choose to ingratiate themselves with the majority for their own protection, and their own desire to conform just enough to receive the benefits of the majority. Black conservatives exist, gay Republicans exist, transgender gender criticals exist. Some men of color join the Proud Boys because their masculinity is more important to them than their ethnicity, and the Proud Boys offer a safe space to be misogynist. Some socially conservative men of color join the Proud Boys because the group offers them a safe space in which to protest immigration and align with other conservative causes. It is not particularly unusual for some in the minority to side with the majority against their own people. There are countless historical instances of this. The majority welcomes their inclusion only because it allows them to deflect criticism by drawing attention to their token allies. So long as an individual minority is working toward the goal of the majority supremacist, that individual is more useful to them inside their ranks than outside. He is, as white people sometimes say, one of the good ones.
Remember, their sole aim, goal, and purpose isn't to ensure that no black lesbian ever has any kind of privilege or power, but to maintain their place in the existing social hierarchy, or failing that, the feeling of superiority which comes with it, as much as possible in the face of massively shifting demographic and social trends. So that being the case, if appointing a few tokens to the cabinet and dialing back the racist and sexist rhetoric a little is the price of maintaining their privilege and power, then that's precisely what they'll do. Not least because after decades of convincing us all that only bad people can ever be racist or sexist, doing the I'm not racist or sexist but equivalent of what corporations do during Pride Month is necessary for them to maintain the conceit that they are in fact the good guys. So you see, because it all depends exclusively on what you feel threatened by in that moment, it's all entirely relative. Regardless of what you felt threatened by last week or last year, the only question is what you're afraid of now, with Christo-fascists who once condemned Harry Potter as satanic now lining up to buy the new blood libel game because JK hates and fears the boogeyman of trans ideology, as much as they do. And more importantly, just as the I'm to the left of Stalin but claims to hate and fear fascism, but then allows the far right to win because they feel more threatened by the boogeyman of the radical authoritarian left, there is often a massive disconnect between our words and beliefs and our actions. So as I'll explain in the next video in this series, this is the reason for the existence of what is known as the libertarian to fascist pipeline, a term used to describe the apparently paradoxical phenomenon of libertarians, small government Republicans, and other self-proclaimed defenders of liberty either being perfectly fine with or even actively embracing the Republican Party's headlong dive into Christo-fascist tyranny.
So Trump's vision for a second term is kind of like if Fox News and Cocaine Bear had a baby. Prison camps for the homeless, anyone? Aw, lock her up was so sweet compared to what Trump is proposing now. Like having the military knock down doors to deport immigrants, launching missiles into Mexico, mandating kids receive a patriotic education, whitewashing history, I believe they call that
indoctrination,
bringing back unconstitutional stop and frisk policing, purging all government workers who aren't loyal to him.
You're fired.
Like his heroes did. And of course, targeting the trans community. Now, I'll admit, not all of Trump's ideas are going to send us straight into a dystopian hell. Some are just idiotic. Like building
Freedom cities.
freedom cities? From the guy who couldn't build a wall? Trump has no plans to make life better, just promises of weaponizing the government against anyone Republicans don't like. And, well, possibly from a prison cell.